An advance of capital is an advance on the total incentive value of a project of up to 50% that can be received by an EEC-approved vendor between Part 1 and Part 2 project application submission. Eligible projects are those that are submitted into the EEC category. Only EEC AVs can submit requests for advance of capital, and only for projects they submit into the EEC category. An EEC AV submitting a project into the public schools category, for example, cannot request an advance of capital for that project. Eligible projects must also have a total REC incentive value of $1.5 million or less. An EEC AV cannot request an advance for a project over $1.5 million in REC incentive value. There is also a cap on the cumulative total of advances awarded to an EEC and its affiliates in a single program year at $5 million in REC incentive value. The purpose of the advance of capital option is to cover any increase in development costs resulting from prevailing wage requirements or project labor agreements, and is designed to overcome barriers in the access to capital faced by equity-eligible contractors. To make a request for an advance of capital, you must follow these 5 steps. First, you will need to finalize your Part 1 application for the project you will be requesting advance for. A request can only be made upon Part 1 application submission and at no point before or after that. A request cannot be made after the submission of your Part 1 application. Secondly, you will need to identify the costs that you would like to have covered by your advance. Your advance can be used to cover any costs related to project development. These can include administrative costs, labor costs, material costs, interconnection costs, or permitting. Notably, the advance can also be used to cover the required project collateral constituting 5% of the value of a system's REC contract, which is due to the counterparty utility within 30 days of the project's approval by the Illinois Commerce Commission. This third step is to complete the request for advance of capital template, which can be found under Section 2 of the Part 1 application in the portal. A screenshot of this part of the application is provided on this slide. You will also need to indicate whether you intend on using your advance to pay your collateral and the type of project for which the advance is for. Once you have completed the request for advance of capital template, you will proceed to step 4, which is uploading your completed request to your Part 1 application. You will upload this in the Part 1 document section in the portal. After submitting your Part 1 application with your attached advance request, your Part 1 application will be reviewed at the same time as your request. Please monitor your email inbox for any follow-up requests from the program administrator during the project review period. Within the request for advance of capital template, there are 2 groups of criteria which related questions for each that must be answered by the AV. They are used to determine whether your request shows need to overcome barriers accessing capital that are unique to your status as an equity-eligible contractor, and whether your request is approved or denied. Your completed request will be reviewed by the program administrator and the Illinois Power Agency. Each criteria group is reviewed and assessed holistically. There is not a point-based scoring regime that determines whether a request is approved or denied. The first criteria group is the threshold criteria. The information you provide in this section is dispositive. If the EEC doesn't demonstrate a need for advance of capital based on evaluation of this criteria group, they will not receive an advance. This criteria includes company information, which requires stating your company's number of staff. The scoring criteria of this criteria is weighted in favor of small companies. Number of submitted projects, which requires listing projects submitted into either the Illinois Shines or Illinois Solar for All programs. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of entities with fewer project applications and projects developed. Ownership structure, which requires listing all company owners and describing their roles, noting any businesses that have minority ownership of your company. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of entities with higher EEP ownership stake and control of the company. Solar market participation, which requires providing the date in which you started operating in the solar market both in Illinois and nationally. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of companies with less years of experience. Completed projects, which requires listing all completed solar projects by size in kWAC, type of project, whether community solar or distributed generation, and location. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of companies with fewer completed projects. Other government funding, which requires disclosing information on any other government funding that is being pursued to fund your project, including the source, status, and when such funds would be made available. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of those who may not have access to other capital sources. Annual revenue, which requires providing documentation that shows annual revenue, such as tax returns, cash flow statements, or balance sheets, which will be treated by the program administrator as confidential. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of businesses with small annual revenue. Private funding, which requires describing any private funding received for other solar or non-solar projects. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of EECs that have not previously received private financing or have only received few or smaller amounts. The second criteria group is the additional criteria. The information you provide in this section is additive. If any EEC demonstrates eligibility for a capital advance based on the threshold criteria, the additional criteria will also be evaluated to make a final determination for receiving an advance. This criteria includes business types, which requires noting if you identify as a minority-owned business, women-owned business, veteran-owned business, or disabled-owned business. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of entities with such certifications. Partnerships, which requires disclosing if there are any companies that do not have an owner stake in the EEC that you intend on partnering with, stating the annual revenue of those partners and noting whether these partners would benefit from the advance of capital. The scoring of this criteria is not weighted. EEP status, which requires highlighting any difficulties or barriers that the majority owner EEP has experienced in starting their business and accessing capital to develop their project, and describing to the extent possible how they connect to the basis for qualification as an EEC. You may also provide evidence or documentation of challenges in accessing capital, such as a letter of denial for financing, or record of loan application history. The scoring of this criteria is not weighted. There are two additional requirements within the Request for Advance of Capital template that are important in making a final determination on whether your request is approved or denied. First, the requester must state the size of their project in AC capacity and the type of project, whether DG or community solar. They must also state the total amount they are requesting. The scoring of this criteria is weighted in favor of DG and smaller projects, and for smaller requests. Second, the requester must provide an itemized list of the specific costs that the advance will cover, which notes what project milestones should trigger the disbursement of the advance. The requester will need to provide documentational proof as verification of achievement for each of these specific milestones upon these milestones being met. The requester should note the documentation that will be provided to verify the meeting of these milestones and the dates in which they expect to meet the milestones. Once your request is approved, Your Part 1 application will proceed to verification, and you will be able to invoice for the milestone cost to use your advance. You will follow these steps to invoice for your advance milestones. Upon meeting a milestone, which should align with the date you provided on your request, you will email the program administrator with your verification documentation. The program administrator will then create an invoice, which you will then send to the contractual utility for the project, which will then grant you access to the advance amount for that milestone cost. You will follow this process for each milestone cost within the advance.